It is a great pleasure to be here, and I thank you for letting me be part of this initiative. I'm a researcher. I basically deal with a lot of numbers, but my passion is to make the world a better place for kids. And for the last 40 years, my work has been trying to figure out how human beings learn to get along. Mostly I study how they don't get along. And in the last few years, the focus has been on bullying. Now, bullying's been around for as long as anyone can remember, but it's always been the elephant in the room. Finally, we're starting to recognize the problem, and it's about time. And this symposium stands as evidence to that fact, and I'm really pleased to be part of this effort. Why are we focusing on it now? Unfortunately, the media has brought our attention to it, owing in large part to the tragic deaths of many of our youth. Our children are telling us over and over again that this is a problem that we must address. And in the last 10 years, probably a little longer, we have seen a proliferation of different programs and efforts to stop bullying. So much so that it becomes really difficult for educators, teachers, and even community workers to figure out what's the best program and practices to use. So the question for me as a researcher is, do these things work? Do anti-bullying programs actually change bullying and reduce it in the schools? And the answer is yes and no. On the positive side, we know that there's not just one way to stop bullying. Two of the most well-researched programs that have been developed, both of which were developed by ministries of education in their respective countries, are very different in their approach. So, for example, one of the long-standing programs is the Ulvaeus anti-bullying program, which emphasizes awareness, discipline, consequences, and sanctions. And in Finland, Salma Vali's Kiva program, which is quite different. It talks about problem-solving methods, whole group approaches, and focuses a lot on bystanders. Both of these programs have been found to reduce bullying by 40% or more, which is not bad. There is a real push now in the field to look at evidence-based practice, and this is not a bad idea, selecting interventions that have proven to be effective. The problem is that proven effectiveness is not a guarantee of success. For example, in Germany, Hanwinkel and colleagues use the Ulvaeus program in a number of schools. And as you can see in this graph, in some schools it reduced bullying, but in other schools, bullying actually increased. So again, it's not a guarantee of success. In the last 5 years, there's been quite a few reviews of the evidence of how much these programs are actually working. And this is basically what these reviewers have come up with, or their conclusions. Some interventions are modestly successful. We don't want to minimize that effect. Those of us who work in the school, we've seen schools transformed. We know it's possible. A few are more effective than others. But currently, we don't know what the best method is. We do know that whole school, multidimensional approaches work best, but overall, the effects are actually small. We change attitudes more than we change behaviors. And overall, one recent meta-analysis showed that when you leave these programs after their model programs and demonstration programs, they're just sort of left to their own devices, we're really reducing bullying more than about 20%. I don't want to make that seem minimal, because for some child, that could be absolutely critical to saving their lives. At the same time, I really believe we can do better. Now, for me, this journey has taken me on a road of trying to figure out why kids bully, because I really believe that if we understood why kids bully, we could design our programs more effectively. And in doing that, I've looked at 3 possibilities. One is psychopathology. Looking at research on clinical psychology, one of the questions I ask is, how much of bullying is because these kids are kind of budding psychopaths in the making? And second, I thought, well, how much of this is part of growing up? How much of this is kids just learning about power and sometimes abusing that power? And to that, I looked to developmental psychology. And finally, I wanted to know about human nature. How much of bullying is about how humans operate? So I'm going to give you a little tour of what I found out in each of those areas. First one, how much of bullying is psychopathology? One of the main things that in North America drew our attention to bullying was the Columbine massacre in 1999. When we were told about the Columbine massacre, it was described as motivated by peer harassment. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were described as 2 secondary students who were victimized and ridiculed by their peers, and they led them to a 3-hour revenge where they took They murdered a teacher and 12 students and wounded 20 others before they took their own lives. Now, over a decade later, David Cullen, in his book, which was based on 9 years of research about that particular incident, they've come to the conclusion that Eric Harris was actually an undiagnosed psychopath, and Dylan Klebold suffered with depression. So one question is, are children who bully really kids who are struggling with mental illness of some sort? We know from a lot of different studies that children who bully others actually show particular tendencies. They tend to be aggressive, they tend to be hyperactive and impulsive, they tend to manipulate others for their own gain, they're narcissistic, they worry about themselves more than others, they're often indifferent to the pain they cause other people, and they tend to lack empathy and anxiety, which Dan Olveus, one of the pioneers in the field, called the roots of human restraint. Now, interestingly, many of these characteristics, though, are in fact characteristics of psychopaths. Finally, in 2012, a study came out that gave me some insight into this possibility. It was a study that was carried out in Greece, and it was they followed kids in grades 7 through 9, and they had kids report on bullying and victimization, as well as dimensions of psychopathology and how much they had conduct problems. And what they found was that kids who were impulsive and especially narcissistic were much more likely to report bullying others. And the combination of psychopathic traits, all three, impulsivity, narcissism, and callous, unemotional traits, really led to even more bullying. And if you combine that with a kid who already had conduct problems, they were already behaving badly, so to speak, then you've got even higher levels. So yeah, for some kids, there are psychopathic tendencies that are contributing to bullying. But in this sample, these are not diagnosed psychopaths, these are kids who are showing tendencies. This represented less than 3% of the population. It's a small portion of the kids out there. The implications, though, are very critical, that for a small group of kids in the world, these are possibly contributing factors that we need to take into account. And for those kids, early identification is absolutely critical. And teachers especially are on a front line that can start recognizing those early warning signs. And we know that early intervention and clinical intervention are needed. And apparently, and I'm not an expert on this, there are some promising new approaches that can help these kids early on. We have to get rid of the stereotype that all psychopaths become serial killers. That's not actually the case. In fact, there's many psychopaths among us. Some of the research by Kevin Dutton in the United States shows that these are often our CEOs. These are the people who can be objective and take sort of cold and calculated risks, and so it's not always bad. And the warning they give, though, the authors of this study, is that traditional punishment-based discipline is the worst thing you could do with these kids, because that's not effective for them. So we really have to think of these kids as a unique subsample of kids that we have to treat somewhat differently. But the problem is that in some of our research, we're showing that we've got lots of kids who are bullying. They're not all budding psychopaths. In fact, in one study, this is about 500 kids from grades 8 to 10, we found that 67% of kids admitted that they bullied others on occasion. Clearly, they're not all suffering from mental illness, okay? So let's not go too far with this. So what about growing up? Is it part of growing up? Developmentally, we know in studies around the world that bullying tends to, you can see it as early as preschool, but it really increases during the elementary school years, and it tends to reach a peak somewhere around the middle school years, somewhere around grades 7 to 10, and then it seems to drop off by grade 12. It never goes away. It's prevalent in our workplace, it's prevalent everywhere. So why does it reach a peak at that point? Well, my background is developmental psychology, and it really dawned on me one day that it makes total sense. Social development is a very slow process. We learn it very gradually over the time that we're in school. And by the time kids reach the end of elementary school, they're pretty sophisticated socially. They can engage in perspective taking, they can figure out what other people are feeling, et cetera. They have all these skills, I don't have time to go into them, that give them the capacity to bully. And yet there's 3 areas that are not yet developed. First of all, about 20 years ago, somebody put a teenager into an MRI machine and found out what teenage parents and teachers knew a long time ago. The brains of teenagers are not fully operational. The frontal lobe of the brain, the part behind your forehead, the part that puts the information together and makes the good decision, starts developing in puberty, ending around age 28. For those of you who still have adolescents, you've got a little while to wait. I'm still waiting on one of mine. But the point is that these kids are still evolving. Also, at about this time, they start going through a period of identity development. They're trying to figure out who they are and how they fit in. And some of them are going to stumble upon bullying because it works. So that's another contributing factor. And finally, there's moral development. Years ago, when they started looking at how people develop morally, they made three major categories or stages of moral development. Now, there's the pre-conventional, the conventional, and the post-conventional. We're not even going to talk about the post-conventional because most of us are post-conventional wannabes, although I think in this room there'd be a lot of us. These are the people who believe in universal human rights and would basically be pacifists under all circumstances. But the truth is that the majority of North Americans are actually in the middle stage, the conventional level of moral development, where we get it. We get it that we live in a society, we each have to do our part, and if we all got to that four-way stop sign and didn't stop, there'd be chaos. So we kind of get it and we behave accordingly. But most children up in through high school are in fact still at the pre-conventional level of moral development where the focus is on what's in it for me. So they'll do the right thing to avoid punishment, they'll do the right thing to get people to like them, but they really don't have a societal perspective on the problem yet. So again, developmentally, they can still get into bullying. What we also know is that these kids are not immoral, that we've been studying this. What we do know, though, is that children often morally disengage, that kids who bully justify, rationalize, and sometimes don't even realize the impact of their behavior on others. So it's really their thinking, oh, I wasn't really bullying him, I was just trying to make people laugh. So we have to really think about how we get to these kids who are they're adults in the making. And bullying is, I think, really important as one thing we have to focus on. One of the big implications here is that we have to stop treating bullying as a discipline problem and start using it as a teaching moment. We have to start helping these kids learn a different way. And finally, I looked at why kids bully. Is it part of human nature? Although bullying drops off by the end of high school, it doesn't go away. It's prevalent in our workplaces. It's prevalent throughout our culture. And bullying, I think, is not just a function of kids developing social skills. That's part of it. But it reflects some sort of nasty side effects of what are adaptive human tendencies that we all have, regardless of age or developmental maturity. Humans are social beings, and in many respects, our behavior reflects tendencies about how people operate in groups. And we've long recognized that bullying is a group phenomenon. Long ago, Dan Olveus, who started a lot of the research here, identified what he called the bullying circle. There's the children who bully, there's the children who get victimized, but there's also reinforcers and supporters, kids that encourage them and egg them on. Then there's the passive supporters and onlookers who basically they don't really condone the behavior, but they also don't do anything, and kids often interpret non-confrontation as condoning the behavior. And then there's defenders and possible defenders, and sadly, these are a small portion of the population. About 17% of kids are identified, mostly girls, as defenders by their peers. Now, thanks to some, what I think, seminal research by Deb Pepler and Wendy Craig, we know observationally that peer bystanders are present in over 85% of the bullying episodes that occur. But they intervene on behalf of the victim only 11% of the time. About half the time they spend passively watching, and 22% of the time they actually help the bully. And when they do, the bully gets more excited, happier, and often more aggressive. So there is a characteristic here that we need to think about this as a human context, not just a child problem. And the implications here is that we have to, as teachers, start understanding group processes, because the bottom line is we can manipulate the group in positive ways. And we also, as the symposium reflects, we have to create safe and caring contexts where these things are unlikely to happen. And what's effective for me, or has been useful for me in understanding this, is group socialization theory. Now, this is a bit of a controversial theory because she kind of said peers are, in some cases, more important than parents, which people get defensive about, myself included. But What Judith Harris did was she put together a whole lot of social psychology research on how humans operate in groups, and this is what she found out. Whenever you put humans into groups, regardless of age, 3 basic processes kick in. First is between groups, we have group contrast effects. As soon as you put people into groups, they start over time vying for their group against the other group. And that's very adaptive. If we were fighting over the last watering hole or the last buffalo, it'd be great to bring the stuff back to our own village. Okay, it's adaptive functioning. The problem is, hopefully we're past the last water hole, but it brings in in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination. A lot of bullying that I see among kids is about just that. It's group favoritism and discrimination. So that's one process. And if you don't believe me, go to a hockey game. It's just amazing. If I split this room into 2 groups, we start playing games, you start focusing on your team. It's so easy to get this to happen in humans that Henry Tajfel, who studied it, called it the minimal in-group paradigm. So we know that that's one process that might contribute to bullying. But when people are in groups, something else happens. First of all, over time, we adopt group norms. We become more and more similar to the groups in which we operate. And what happens then is some kids come into these groups and they're different, and they get penalized for that, and they get bullied for that. So another group process that has a nasty side effect. And finally, when you put people into groups, we create hierarchies. We do social comparisons. Are you faster? Are you better? Are you prettier? Are you richer? You have a nicer house. And we create hierarchies. And so there's dominance and power. And a lot of bullying happens because of what they call alpha males or alpha females, keeping the others down so they're still in power. So these processes, I think, are normal human processes, but in fact, they also contribute to the likelihood of bullying. The group is very powerful, and Harris talks about how we as adults are not group members, but we can understand how groups operate in a way that we hadn't understood before. First of all, she points out that peers don't push, they pull. Children get their ideas of how to behave by identifying with the group and taking on its behaviors and attitudes. Most of them do it willingly. They want to be with those other kids. Secondly, kids operate with the majority rule, that if you're the one that isn't behaving the way the group wants to behave, you're the one that's got to change, and they put pressure on you to do so. And their weapons are teasing and exclusion. Nana nana is actually a universal. It's in all cultures that we use that kind of exclusion to torture other people into conforming to the group. Teachers are if Harris is right, teachers are in an amazing position to influence the group. They're never part of the group, but they have the capacity to influence the group. They can influence the group's norms. They can influence the image or stereotype of the group. They can influence the boundaries of the group. And Harris goes into examples of how to do this. But the idea is, if she's right, teachers are more powerful than we ever realized because they're one of the few people that have control over the group, more so than parents. And if they can create an us, a we, rather than a splitting of us and them within the group, they can actually reduce bullying. I think it also says that if we're going to really address bullying, we have to see bullying in a different way. We have to see bullying as part of a larger social issue called social emotional learning. What is it? Social emotional learning is kind of everything that Brian and others have told us about. It's what we'd want our kids to do. It's their ability to manage and recognize emotions, to care about others, to make good decisions, to behave ethically and responsibly, to develop positive relationships. It's clearly what we want our children to do. And the good news is there's lots of ways to do it. There's not just one possibility. In fact, there's an Apache saying that there's many paths to the top of the mountain. And in fact, that's true. We can do social emotional learning and teach kids better ways to interact in so many ways, through cooperative learning, through discipline practices, through conflict resolution and social problem-solving training programs, through emotional literacy, through moral education, through positive relationships, not only between adults and kids, but among kids themselves, and also through anti-bullying initiatives. And I'm going to speak to that later today about all these different ways we can do it. But the bottom line is we have an opportunity, and perhaps we actually have an obligation to work with the next generation to make this world a better place. And I leave you with the words of a young girl who was victimized through most of her educational career. And she gave me this conclusion. I told her I had to go and I had to finish up a talk. She goes, I'll give you an ending. And this is the ending she wrote. In conclusion, there is no conclusion to what children who are bullied live with. They take it home with them at night. It lives inside of them and it eats away at them. It never ends, so neither should our struggle to end it. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for listening.